Good evening and welcome to the 27th ANU School of Art annual lecture. I'm shocked to discover that it's the 27th. I still thought 25 at a pip, but 27. So it is now officially a venerable institution and a very proud part of the School of Art's outreach program. Our speaker tonight is Elizabeth Ann McGregor. And so I'm very pleased that Elizabeth has drawn such a wonderful and enthusiastic crowd. And I know that there are a lot of people who've come here from across the university and from the wider community of Canberra to hear Liz Ann speak tonight. So a very warm welcome to you all, as well as to the staff and students of the School of Art. Trained as an art historian at Edinburgh University, Liz Ann McGregor commenced her career in the art world as a curator of the Scottish Arts Council's Travelling Gallery. This job could definitely be seen to be Liz Ann's apprenticeship in the industry, an apprenticeship in which she had to literally and metaphorically take her exhibitions to the people, transporting and introducing the work of young Scottish artists to new audiences in local villages, inner city estates, schools, hospitals and prisons. And I guess I'm confessing the kind of convictions of my own generation here when I think about the sort of altruistic politics of programs like that. And that kind of job does actually require a special kind of impassioned advocacy. And if her interest in contemporary art was honed during that period, I think it's probably fair to say that her considerable communication skills were honed in that period too. She quickly rose through the ranks in Britain to work in the Arts Council of Great Britain and as director of the internationally renowned Icon Gallery in Birmingham. Now, in 1999, when Liz Ann was appointed director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, it's fair to say that the institution was living through interesting times, confronted with a crisis of identity, coupled with a severe financial emergency. Liz Ann used her considerable advocacy skills to broker a sponsorship with Telstra that enabled the museum to introduce free admission, a policy that I think conforms to her deep interest in bringing contemporary art to as broad an audience as possible. And perhaps just as important as the stability that she's brought to the MCA's future has been her continued interest in extending the MCA's audience base through the establishment of programs in places like Western Sydney and across New South Wales. This year, the MCA, this year's brought another crowning achievement to the MCA with the opening of the long-awaited, and I think it's probably fair to say long-contested, redevelopment of the museum's premises. 7 months down the track from its completion in March, the newly refurbished MCA has expanded its exhibition space, implemented a series of major commissions from artists that really lie at the centre of the kind of fabric and the spirit of the building and the institution. And central to her vision for the rejuvenated museum is, interestingly enough, its National Centre for Creative Learning and its commitment to outreach programs that are designed to develop an audience for contemporary art in future generations. Now, Liz is the recipient of a number of awards for her distinguished contribution to the arts in Australia, including an OBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours List in 2011 and the awarding of an Australia Council Medal, both of which are richly deserved. I can't help feeling that this recognition is due in large part to the fact that she's been a highly visible advocate for the visual arts. And in many ways, I feel as though this introduction is a little bit unnecessary because I'm sure that most of the people here will share with me a feeling that we already know Liz Ann from her very visible and articulate presence in the national media's arts programs and in her work on various boards and committees. Arts advocacy bodies like the Council of Australian Art Museum Directors, for example. Now, the art world has always needed such passionate advocates. It's not always true that art speaks for itself. But I feel that We've never needed advocates like Lisanne more than we do in times like this, when the arts have never seemed more besieged. Faced with shrinking training opportunities through the closure of visual arts courses in TAFEs in Victoria and New South Wales, the under-resourcing of art schools and universities, and an ever-shrinking, or at least stagnant, federal arts budget, the visual arts really does need the voice of people like Lisanne to speak up for the importance of a future for the visual arts in Australia. Today, in the ANU School of Arts annual lecture in 2012, she'll speak about the future of museums. Expanding the museum, connecting artists with audiences is in fact her title. And tonight she's going to talk about the role of the museum and how it's changed in response to social, political and technological transformations. And of course she'll use her newly refurbished MCA as a very good case study. So as the head of the Art Theory Department, which traditionally hosts this event, I'd like to warmly welcome Lisanne McGregor to the school and thank you very much for agreeing to be our annual lecturer this year.
Thank you for that very warm welcome. It gives me great pleasure to be here in Canberra. I'm actually going to apologise at the beginning because the beginning of my talk I'm actually very much talking from my own personal history and because my response initially to museums took place in the UK, a lot of what I'm talking about is the political context there, some of which was not relevant at the time here, but I think the more I hear what you're saying now, it may actually become more relevant now, and you'll see why as I go through this. I've titled tonight's talk, Expanding the Museum, Connecting Artists with Audiences. A museum is, of course, many things to many different people. The term has its etymological derivation from the Greek term museion. I'm sure some Greek scholars will correct my dreadful accent there, meaning the seat or the shrine to the muses. But when we consider the early concept of the museum, such as the Great Museum at Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BC, we already encounter the multidimensional function that museums have played in history, as homes for the reverence of artefacts and places of contemplation, reflection and education. The UK Association of Directors and Chief Executives of National Museums has in recent years published a manifesto for museums in the 21st century, and describes their role as follows. We preserve the past, define the present, and educate for the future. Our collections present the material evidence of the creativity of humankind and the riches of the natural world. They inspire, enthrall, and enlighten. I wonder how this redefinition of the traditional museum relates to how contemporary art operates in today's society. In their manifesto, the British Association of Directors are rethinking the traditional museum, but being British, I wonder whether they're looking at art museums, which are predominantly known as galleries. For example, the Tate Gallery and the Scottish Gallery of Modern Art. When dealing with the contemporary, those large institutions in the UK have more in common with contemporary galleries such as the Whitechapel and the Serpentine. And I myself have to confess to a somewhat problematic relationship with the word museum. It conjures up to me something rather old-fashioned, and it took me some time to adjust to the fact when I moved here that I'm actually running one. I remember one occasion talking to our registrar about the installation of a particular artwork. She told me that we had to do this and that, and the next thing the artist was actually present, which I pointed out. I was getting completely irate about this and said at one point, we're not running a museum. She said, yes, we are. Now, the MCA is called a museum because it was in fact modelled on the US, the MoMA in New York and the MCA in Chicago. And of course, when you put the word museum alongside contemporary, you have a fairly heady mix. Now, I did my training in art history and then I went on to study curatorship. But in those days, I'm not going to confess how long ago it was, curatorship was more about connoisseurship, how to tell one piece of elegant porcelain from another. The strict definition of the term curator is, of course, a keeper or custodian of a museum or other collection. Unless, of course, you're a fan of cricket, in which case it's the person who looks after the pitch. I only learnt that when I came to Australia. Nowadays, in the art world, the term curator has become synonymous with exhibition organiser, with a new emphasis on this interface between the artist and the audience. When I went to do my postgrad in museum studies in the 1980s, there were only 2 courses, one specialising in traditional museums and the other in the applied and decorative arts. Nowadays, of course, there's a plethora of courses devoted to curating, with the emphasis on the contemporary and on the public. Who that public is has had a fundamental effect on the role of the curator. Now, this change in the focus of training signifies a shift in how museums operate. In contrast to the traditional Enlightenment era vision of the museum as a place to indulge an encyclopedic disposition, the position of a museum as a treasure trove, a collection, or a cabinet of curiosities is no longer adequate. Museums are no longer passive entities. They've evolved into dynamic sites of relations and, above all, connect artists with communities through multiple avenues of engagement. Museums, of course, have been influenced heavily by economic and political contexts. The 19th century saw proliferation of museums as a source of civic pride for imperial powers seeking to educate their public. The 20th century was marked by political and economic changes that periodically provoked government reassessment of the roles that museums could play. After the traumas of the Second World War, there was an understanding that the state needed to take a role in supporting and investing in culture and the arts, moving from an aristocratic model of patronage to a model where the state became involved for the greater good. This led to the establishment of the Arts Council of Great Britain, which was established to make high culture more widely available. Not so very different from the 19th century idea of the museum as a place of enlightenment for the masses. However, this post-war consensus began to fall apart during the 1970s. Economic downturns led to a reconsideration of public finances. Museums were forced to reconsider their modus operandi. And in Britain, the shift was ideological as much as economic. The Thatcher years from 1979 accelerated this shift in public policy, away from the acceptance of the arts to a questioning as to whether they should be in receipt of public funding at all. As the pressure to roll back state involvement and encouraged what was named plural funding began, museums and galleries underwent fundamental changes. The Arts Council was under intense pressure to justify its very existence. Public good was no longer enough. The arts scrambled to adopt the new language of economic regeneration, investment and commerce, a far cry from the heady days of art for art's sake, when it was enough for the curator to curate the art, to research and present exhibitions of the highest quality, expecting that those who were worthy or interested enough would come. No one ever mentioned the word marketing, and few curators were ever called on to interact with the public, other than in the setting of a formal lecture. The general public was a very secondary consideration. As the impetus to develop money-making facilities became paramount, so did the need to focus on widening the audience, drawing people into galleries and persuading them to part with their cash in shops, cafes and membership schemes. This was particularly challenging for the contemporary art world, which ironically had been modelled on the commercial sector in both its type of programming, exhibitions changing every 4 weeks, and the attitude to their audience, indifferent at best, patronising at worst. But of course, public galleries needed public subsidy because they didn't sell the art. The new focus on marketing led to a famous and much derided campaign by one of Britain's most esteemed museums, the Victoria and Albert, which adopted the slogan, "An ace cafe with a nice museum attached." The attacks on this really summed up the mood of the 80s, and it became a topic of great debate. Did having a good cafe really detract from the museum experience? Nowadays, of course, no self-respecting art gallery can avoid the drive to provide the best cappuccino in town, and in the case of the MCA, one of the best views to do it. The relationship between the visitor and the museum, or indeed the theatre or the concert hall, was subjected to the same Thatcherite pressures as many other areas of society. Just as users of trains became known as customers rather than passengers, there was a move to treat people who go to museums as patrons and consumers rather than visitors. Now, there was great resistance to all these changes and much debate about their impact, as artistic directors feared that these pressures would lead to a dumbing down of the art. I can remember this disdain with which a marketing course aimed at directors of the leading contemporary museums was greeted some 20 years ago. "What do we need to know about marketing?" they chorused. "If you do good exhibitions, people will come. The right people will come, that is." There was a similar resistance to any form of management training. The autocratic artistic director ruled the roost. There was no room for questioning or any resemblance of democratic input about what might be on show in the galleries. Artistic directors knew best and put that on. And of course, they did do great exhibitions. They had that old-fashioned attribute, a good eye, meaning the ability to select work of a certain kind and present it to the highest possible standard. They worked closely with artists, and they were passionate and well-informed about their subject. And this model was not confined to the visual arts. The directors of the major performing arts companies had a similar philosophy, although the box office-driven nature of the performing arts made it harder to ignore the audience. The resistance to having to adopt business planning and indeed sponsorship was in some ways understandable. I once heard the director of the National Theatre bemoaning the fact that he chose to go into the arts because he didn't want to have to deal with people in business with totally different values. Now he seemed to spend most of his time as director of the National Theatre trying to persuade these very people to support his organisation. Marketing was, of course, essential, and surely all curators and indeed artists would like to see more people come to their exhibitions. But then again, maybe not. I remember when I first came to Sydney, I was castigated by a prominent curator about my attitude to audiences. He thought I was overemphasising the need for the MCA to re-engage, and that contemporary art really should be only for the aficionados who were prepared to work really hard to understand it. I sighed. Now, the need to raise private sector support has also had a significant impact, and no major gallery is complete without a development department. Contemporary art galleries had to embrace all this new terminology, proving their business case as they raced to adopt the economics of the shopping trolley. Business planning, sponsorship strategies, income generation, marketing strategies, incentive funding. I could go on. I do sometimes wonder whether all of this really has made an impact on museums in terms of what they're able to deliver, or whether it's all smoke and mirrors. Spend money to convince people to give you money. However, the emphasis on broadening museum audiences cannot be solely attributed to fiscal belt-tightening during the 70s and 80s. While the right wing bellowed about letting the market decide, museums were also under attack from the left for their elitism and exclusive nature. And indeed, it is true that artists and audience were decisively white and middle class. I worked in the Arts Councils in the late 70s when these debates were just beginning, and it was fiery. I remember going to a conference and being astonished to be on the receiving end of a vituperative attack on the arts as a product of post-colonial patronising racism by a prominent artist of African Caribbean descent. As a colleague of mine commented afterwards, working in the Arts Council, she fully expected to have to defend the policies of her department, of the Arts Council, and even by extension the British government. She didn't expect, however, to take on the sins of the British Empire. I moved to Birmingham at the beginning of the Thatcher years, right into the heart of the debate, a city where only 1 in 4 of the citizens was of white Anglo origin. What was the role of a contemporary gallery in such a city, and on what basis should it receive public funds? Contemporary galleries were indeed at the pointy end of these fiery and challenging debates, but conventional museums were equally under attack. Whose history did they represent? Whose stories did they tell, and for whom? These two pressures, the need to justify public funding and attract new sources of money, and the pressure to diversify programming and be more inclusive, coalesced into something rather interesting, a much greater focus on the audience. And interestingly, contemporary galleries moved way ahead in the debate, implementing new and radical ways of working to justify their raison d'etre. One of the key ways, of course, was to focus on education in its widest sense, engaging audiences in a whole range of ways. Now every gallery needed not only a cafe and a gift shop, but an education and public programmes team, or at least one staff member. Now some of this was undertaken with a certain degree of cynicism, but I have no doubt that this crucial work, which began in the 80s, played a crucial role in the increasing acceptance of contemporary art. Who would have thought that the heritage-minded and conservative Brits would so wholeheartedly embrace the opening of Tate Modern in 2002, to universal acclaim, even from notorious British tabloids? At the MCA, we focused very much on involving the artist in our education programmes. Craigie Horsfield here, as you see, addressing a very eager group in the galleries, and Samuel Fosso addressing a group of school children. The other side of the drive for audience was a concern to reach new audiences beyond the usual white and middle class. All museums developed various kinds of outreach programmes, again, some of which paid little more than lip service, or what became known as tick syndrome. Tick, we've done that one. However, there were some very laudable attempts to grapple with this issue of how you break down the barriers to greater engagement with contemporary art. At the Icon Gallery, we again turned to artists. When we closed for the renovation of a new building, we set up a number of projects with artists and community groups. Yinka Shonabar, for example, worked with the African Caribbean community over 6 months, making a work that actually ended up as part of his solo exhibition at the Icon, bringing the community engagement right into the gallery rather than leaving it out on the periphery. This kind of work challenged a historical divide in Britain between the so-called community arts and high art as presented in a gallery. This traditional opposition has had its boundaries pushed by museum initiatives, which in a seemingly paradoxical fashion seek to simultaneously broaden the definition of culture by working from the bottom up, while also encouraging greater access to art in the gallery. As part of its mission to address the stereotypes that exist about contemporary art and who its audience might be, particularly the notion that contemporary art is elitist, the MCA has over the years very seriously looked at how to engage with new audiences. I've always argued that building audiences needs much more than marketing campaigns. It requires a shift in perceptions of contemporary art. We identified improving our connections with Western Sydney as an important priority, and in 2000 formed our first partnership with the Blacktown Festival, running buses to the Sydney Biennale for local people. The Mayor of Blacktown became a surprising advocate for the MCA and we in turn supported the establishment of Blacktown's own contemporary gallery, which has gone from strength to strength. We've also initiated a programme known as C3 West, which seeks to engage communities, contemporary art and commerce in a way that highlights the important connections between these spheres. C3 West is a collaboration between the museum and galleries in Western Sydney, and it works with businesses and with artists, moving beyond conventional models of arts business engagement such as sponsorship or public art. C3 West helps to deliver 2 key aspects of our mission: our drive to build new audiences and a commitment to create new working opportunities for artists. A very unexpected collaboration with the Penrith Panthers, the rugby league club in Western Sydney. Again, an unlikely alliance that has proved extraordinarily valuable for both parties. Craig Walsh worked with the Panthers over a number of years, creating a number of projects, including this very first one, which was a wonderful series of portraits of the players, all taken at the moment of the game finishing. And it was a bad season. The Panthers weren't doing very well, so they all look pretty gloomy, I'm afraid. We also worked with Ash Keating on a project with CETA, which was the waste disposal company, to draw attention to the fact that people weren't recycling. And Ash made a fantastic series of performances and installations using all the material from the local tip that should have been recycled and wasn't. He notoriously put a lot of this waste in front of the townhouse, the council house in Penrith. And when the local MP opened the exhibition, he said, well, people always tell me contemporary art is a lot of rubbish, and here it is indeed, a load of old rubbish. And what that actually did was very interesting, because what he managed to do was to tap into the debate about what people were and were not doing through the artwork that he produced. And it was the company was very happy with the results. A project that no amount of leaflets or distribution of information could actually have achieved the same outcome. In addition to these initiatives, free access was introduced to the museum in 2000, and a major press campaign encouraging people who'd never been to a contemporary art gallery to try it out. With the increased focus on audiences, museums entered a period of visitor feedback forms and research into what the general public expects. A pattern that has emerged in this research indicates that it is no longer enough to put the work on the wall and let it speak for itself. Rather, the general public is looking for choice and diverse methods of engagement with museums, and above all, more information. Every single museum survey comes to the same conclusion. Visitors want more, not less. They want to know who the curator is, why they made the choices they did, and what were some of the influences on the artists. Museums needed to recognise that everyone comes to a museum with their own baggage, their own experience that they bring to bear on a work of art. There is no one answer to the question, what does it mean? Meaning shifts depending on the perception of the viewer. How to respond to this public demand and to generate the sense that people can and should have their own opinions has been the subject of much debate. As I've said, bringing contemporary artists into it has been a critical part of our strategy. The past few decades have seen this important shift towards the provision of different kinds of experience and ways of interpreting work within the art museum has often been resisted by artists. And I have to confess that this has always bemused me. After all, we curators go to artists' studio and ask lots of questions. We then put the work in the gallery and we expect the public to come in and immediately understand or have some experience of what they're looking at. But our decisions are based on a whole lot of knowledge that we never make clear to the audience. I've always been confused by why we would deny something that is perfectly obvious. But of course, interpretation is fraught with difficulties. I think artists' resistance to it comes from bad experiences where curators, or worse, education teams, put new meanings onto the work and tell the public what to think. Artists and curators should be trying to open up debate, not close it down. Rather than questioning what does it mean, it should be what does it mean to you? By providing information that curators gain in their studio visits, all they need to do is provide background, trying to encourage the idea that encounters with art are a dialogue. At the MCA, we've tried to do this in a number of ways. We introduced the idea of child guides. There was some internal resistance to this idea on the grounds that children couldn't possibly give out the correct information. While of course it's important not to give out incorrect factual information, my point in introducing these younger children is precisely to challenge the notion of the authoritative view. Indeed, any volunteer guides programme has to be taken in this vein. I always say that as long as the guides make it clear that it is their response to the work and not necessarily that of the artist or the museum, what better way is there to encourage an audience to realise they can form their own opinions that are equally valid? Some of the best volunteer guides incorporate visitor observations into their talks, so by the end of an exhibition the tours can be very different. Another programme that's encountered some perplexed responses is a programme for the under fives. How can young children seriously engage with contemporary art? One of my curators said in the early days. I think this questioning raises the issue of the ways in which contemporary art has been framed, or dare I suggest, imprisoned within a certain kind of academic debate. Although of course an understanding of art can be a complex business, and people should have access to the ways in which they can learn more about it. But I do believe that in being too precious about it, we actually shut out the possibility of a deeper understanding of art, an understanding that makes people feel included rather than excluded. The great joy, of course, of working with contemporary art today is that there is no one orthodoxy, no single right or wrong way to make art or to respond to it. I believe there is simply art that is more or less interesting and stimulating, and that, of course, is highly subjective. We've introduced our new National Centre for Creative Learning, where we aim to encourage creative learning in people of all ages, starting with the art, encouraging people to look at art in the galleries before they come to the new centre and try other things. And yes, we do start with babies. Although in fact, Art Baby is not a programme for the babies, it's a programme for the carers. We don't mind if the babies cry. Sometimes labelled the democratisation of art, and at other times the vulgarisation of art, I think it's true to say that some of these initiatives within museums have challenged the idea of art being a place only for the elite, who have their own opinions, values and aesthetics reiterated and reinforced. The Contemporary Art Museum has become a forum for diverse opinions, diverse ideas, different aesthetics and traditions, which cross-pollinate in a symbiotic relationship between art, popular culture, and even craft. Indeed, at the MCA, we've been invigorated by the connections between different communities coming out of our initiatives to reach beyond the traditional gallery-going demographic and touch the lives of Australians from all walks of life. In this sense, artists and their audiences are connecting in an ever more complex but engaged fashion. With the audience for contemporary art expanding, artists are no longer directed simply towards pleasing their patrons. They're an important part of a web within a creative community that has no defined borders. How do we respond to the fears expressed in the 80s and early 90s about dumbing down? I would argue that it's not about dumbing down, it's expanding the ways in which art is shown and engages the audience. And what we have seen over the years, of course, is an astonishing increase in visitor numbers to contemporary museums all over the world. And of course, this broadening of the Contemporary Art Museum audience coincides with the broadening of the definition of the art object over the past century. Gone are the days when the museum was restricted to hanging pictures and installing sculptures. The art world has undergone a radical transformation, and just look at the extraordinary range of art in galleries today. Museums have, of course, the challenge of putting on this incredible diversity. How can one programme truly give an overview of current practice? We have also, of course, seen this addressed with the rise of biennales, huge exhibitions, very large scale and ambitious, that bring together often incredibly different work into one context. For just as the boundaries regarding the audience have been broken, so have the boundaries regarding the art. Curators can no longer confine themselves to the centres of New York and London. Contemporary art is truly global, and curators have to travel extensively. This, of course, has opened up even more questions about how curators can possibly make informed choices about what to exhibit, which is perhaps a topic for another occasion. The very real debate about diversity has also made an impact, and exhibition programmes are much more representative of the cultural makeup of their country. The rise of China, market-fueled as it is, means that commercial galleries now all show Chinese artists in their stable as a matter of course, something that was unimaginable 20 years ago. The demographics of visitors, however, have not shifted as much as museum professionals would like to see. And even art forms that were marginal are now able to sit centre stage. Museums, of course, have always faced challenges with leading edge and innovative work, such as performance art and ephemeral work that defies the conventions of the art object. There can be no better sign of how the times have changed than the success last year of Marina Abramovich's exhibition at MoMA, which attracted over 850,000 people, to an artist whose work is clearly one of the most important and leading edge in the world. I suspect, however, that the nudity of some of the performances may have had something to do with the huge numbers. Just recently, the Guggenheim published their Still Spotting programme, which explores sound and stillness in urban environments through an off-site programme throughout New York City boroughs. When we opened last year, we had a performance programme as an integral part of the opening season. A series of projects took place in different parts of the museums at different times, and by their very nature, they could only engage with a very small number of people. One of the projects, however, was out on the forecourt and involved the creation, just have to catch up with myself here, of a project called, it's not there. Well, I'll have to describe it to you. It's the United Nations for Dachshunds. This wonderful project by Bernard Miller involved the construction of the Forum for the United Nations, and dogs, Dachshunds, auditioned and were allowed to sit in places. China behaved very badly. The US didn't get on with the UK, and I think Kenya was a bit of a problem at one point. Anyway, it was a very wonderful analogy for the nightmare of the United Nations politics. Stuart Ringholt's nude tours were also very popular and newsworthy, reaching the front pages of the art sections of the New York Times. So who says performance art has to remain marginal? Now, I should say a few words here about the role of the media. For so long, contemporary art was subjected to waves of diatribe in the press. When I came in '99, the museum was famously described as a gallery for wankers. And here, a great gallery, pity about the art. But I have to say that the Australian press is nothing in comparison to the British tabloids when they get going. In the Icon, when we got money for a new building, one of the tabloids mounted a scurrilous campaign against us, claiming that the £6 million for the new building was to be spent on a pile of potatoes, a reference to a recent exhibition by the Argentinian artist Victor Grippo. I laugh now, but at the time it was pretty horrendous, as the phones rang hot with people ringing up to shout and scream at us about how we were taking money away from sick children to put on piles of potatoes. Times have indeed changed. The Museum of Contemporary Art is now regularly voted Sydney's favourite museum, somewhat to my astonishment, and we've received many other awards. And artists are more likely to be found on the social pages than on the front pages of the Daily Telegraph. Contemporary art has indeed gone from margin to mainstream, and I think it's something we should applaud. Artists, of course, are also moving comfortably from gallery to studio to public space, sometimes making work that responds to other agendas. Danny Marty here and Michaela Dwyer. The rise of interest in socially engaged practice is a significant shift away from artists working away in their studios, waiting to be discovered by discerning curators. Indeed, some of the most exciting work being produced today comes from artists working in new contexts outside the traditional gallery system. This is a work by Christopher Grennan and Sperandio with a group of young people that we did during the Icon closure. Many artists move happily from the gallery system and back again. Raquel Ormella here, who's undertaken a number of works about Tasmania and the situation with logging, here in an exhibition called In the Balance at the MCA. The range of work that exists today is extraordinarily diverse, as is the manner of audience participation, and many projects, both within and outside museums, are initiated by artists themselves. Now, however, one of the most complex transformations that is taking place is how museums can respond to the emergence of the digital sphere, and with it, digital art. One incredible consequence, of course, relates to the reduction of space and time that enables new interactions between artists and institutions. Curator at MoMA Barbara London has described the concrete impact of digital technology and the internet upon the art world. She says, a scholar in Taiwan can browse the catalogue of the New York Public Library. Sotheby's emails to its bidders images of artworks on auction. Bytes transfer trillions of dollars around the world daily. Information traffic is exploding and transforming societies in ways that are only dimly perceived. Aside from the amazing speed at which the art world is able to communicate about its work, ideas and programs across the globe, it is worthwhile recognizing the way in which these digital avenues allow us to reach a much greater public further away than we would ever have dreamed. At the MCA, in our new Centre for Creative Learning, we've created a number of programs using very sophisticated video conferencing. It's still in its very early days. We're working out how best to be able to teach, not simply having classes look in through the video conferencing, but actually some form of meaningful exchange. We also have a program of digital excursions. This is a project up in Arnhem Land, which in fact we did using Skype, where Keith Munro, our curator of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander programs, went up there in connection with an exhibition of bark painting we had at the museum, and a number of the bark painters came from this part of Arnhem Land. he was able to link this classroom with Vernon Aki in his studio in Brisbane. Astonishingly, by the end of the week, there were children in the school that the teachers couldn't remember having seen for quite a long time. Word had gone out into the community that this exciting new way of learning and engaging with artists was something that every child in the community wanted to be part of. The power, indeed, of art to effect some kind of social transformation. Our digital classroom in the museum also allows young people to undertake projects within the museum, and our projects, we obviously want to encourage people to come to the museum as well as experience it remotely. In the next 5 years, digital learning at the MCA will be central in encouraging the engagement of more visitors. We can provide different kinds of information through the digital media. And in fact, I do believe that digital can provide the answer to one of the things that artists often complain about, which is the forest of labels that sometimes appear in museums with endless descriptions and information about work. Nowadays, we can supply that information digitally on apps and on phone, which people can download to their own phones or take from iPads available at the front desk. In our case, apps which actually allow you to locate yourself in the museum and then download information about the works on view. I'm sure many of you will have experienced the very sophisticated version of this that exists down at Mona in Tasmania. If you have, you may have some comments to make about the kind of content that is on that particular device. But we're always looking for ways in which, first and foremost, we get the artist's voice there, and secondly, the voice of the curator. And I'm pleased to say that I do believe there has been a marked shift in artists' attitudes towards putting this kind of information out. And artists are more and more interested in being interviewed and allowing their voice to actually be heard. The days when artists could just stay in the studio and do their work and hope for the best, I'm afraid, have long gone. Unless, of course, you happen to be Anish Kapoor. More of that anon. One of the exciting things we've initiated recently is a series of projects called The Artist's Voice, where we interview artists that we're going to be exhibiting and then make versions of them available on the internet. There are, of course, great concerns with the internet in terms of copyright issues and so on, and I think we're going to see some extraordinarily radical changes happen over the next few years, trying to hold back the tide of people sharing information and sharing images is actually impossible, and I think the sooner that artists and museums embrace it, the better. We had a long debate in the museum over the taking of photographs, which of course you're not supposed to do in museums. Again, my answer is we have to, because of course people come in with their cameras and their phones and they want to take an instant snap of the work, and why not? I don't think those works the photographs that are taken in that context are ever going to be used in any way that would undermine an artist's ability to make money from their work. I could be wrong, however. We're only just at the beginning of this very exciting journey, and is this, of course, the ultimate challenge to the art museum? Do we really need art museums? Can it all exist on the internet in the digital age? And how far and how much should we do in terms of giving up the authorial voice? As I've said earlier, challenging the notion that there is one view and one voice is something I've always been interested in, and of course it lends itself perfectly to the culture of today. Are visitors' views in blogs as useful or important to our mission as those of so-called experts? Now, this debate, of course, is not confined to art museums. It's running rampant around journalism and criticism at the moment, and it is fascinating. What happens to debates about standards and quality with regard to art, which I sense is another topic? Suffice to say that because of my strong emphasis on the role of artists, I do think we must have these different voices and different opinions. And I have to say the irony in the world of contemporary visual arts is that these new voices are much more supportive of contemporary art than the jaded and faded attitudes of the critics who adorn the pages of our major newspapers. The museum still has to decide what does and doesn't get shown, which of course raises the issue of criteria. Weighing up what is worth putting on and what is worth collecting, more importantly, remains a key responsibility of curators, and I don't know any who take it lightly. We're all extremely aware of our responsibility to artists and to audiences. There is also the question of whether the next generation will want to bother coming to museums if they can access this great, wonderful world online. There is lots of research now that shows that museums that have good websites, in fact, have seen an increase in their numbers. Good websites drive people to the museum. There is still a strong desire for the real. This is our Generation Next programme for teenagers. The museum has been running for 4 years now. And these young people, we initially intended there would be probably 100 to 150 at each event. There are now regularly between 400 and 500 young people coming to this event. And what's really heartening is their desire to see the art. Yes, it's social. Yes, they come to interact with their friends, and they certainly use their technology to tell everybody about it. But what they value above all is being able to have contact with artists and to see contemporary art in the museum. There is simply no substitute for the real. This kind of work really heartens me. I do believe that young people nowadays are interested in what is happening in contemporary art, perhaps even more interested than generations before. And I'm a little tired of hearing that the internet is where it's at. Of course, digital technology is important as a means of communication and indeed as a means of making art. But above all, why wouldn't we have crowds of people coming into a museum like this? Annie Leibovitz, of course, is the show that we did just before we closed the museum for the refurbishment. And that did indeed generated a lot of debate. Was this the thin end of the wedge? A celebrity photographer? Was the MCA finally succumbing to being dumbed down? My answer to that is, look at the exhibition. It was not an exhibition of Leibovitz's celebrity photographs. It was a wonderful exhibition of her talent as a photographer and her ability to articulate what it is like to live in the world today. The exhibition focused as much on her family relationships and indeed her relationship with the late great Susan Sontag as it did on her portraits of Nicole Kidman. Many people came to this exhibition because, of course, of her great her popularity and knowledge of her in the wider world, and I think we're astonished to see a whole range of work in the Museum of Contemporary Art. At the MCA, we take the view that while contemporary art may not be for everyone, it should be available and accessible to those who choose to go on what is often an exciting, exhilarating, fascinating, perplexing, and occasionally uplifting journey into the world of art today. I once heard Sir Nicholas Sirota, the director of the Tate Gallery, talk about what it was like to go into an artist's studio. And this was when he was already director of the Tate and embarking on the launch of Tate Modern. And he said, whenever I go into an artist's studio, for the first time, I have this sense of fear, a fear of the unknown. If the director of the Tate can admit to a fear of the unknown, then what must a member of the public feel like going into a contemporary art gallery or museum for the first time? It is this sense of fear that we have to change, and we can do it by changing the context, not by changing the art. At the end of the day, visitors can be open and excited by art if it is presented in a way that does not alienate them, using language that makes them feel included, not excluded. Exclusion is one of the biggest challenges we have to face. I think galleries and museums should be at the core of a nexus of relationships. They can interact in different ways with different communities of interest. Engaging audiences must be central to all museum practice and not just an add-on outreach project. Breaking down those hierarchies between gallery and outreach, between exhibitions and education, between gallery art, public art, and community art is paramount. The challenge facing museums where all too often we still hear the unsophisticated cry for more art for the people, whoever they may be, is to refute the idea that galleries have become irrelevant. We need to demonstrate the vitality of contemporary art today and its value in the wider social and political domain. As a curator and museum director, I always like to end with the words of an artist. American artist Hans Haacke, in his essay Museums, Managers of Consciousness, articulates the challenges that face art museums and their important place in contemporary society as follows. It was never easy for museums to preserve or retain a degree of maneuverability and intellectual integrity. It takes stealth, intelligence, determination, and some good luck. But a democratic society demands no less. Thank you.
Lisanne, thank you very, very much for what I saw as a very intelligent and insightful perspective on the possibilities of museums to really shape public's intelligent engagement with contemporary art. I was particularly affected by the material that you showed about the way in which your Centre for Creative Learning was able to actually reach right out into remote Aboriginal communities and bring the works of those communities that have been so long in the possession and the collections of cities in Australia and white communities back into those communities in ways that are obviously profoundly important culturally and intellectually to those communities. So thank you very much for that. I would like to acknowledge, as well as Lisanne's fantastic contribution to our annual lecture program, the funding of Arts ACT for the Art Schools outreach program. The annual lecture is a part of that outreach program, and our art forums, which we offer twice weekly during the semester, is another aspect of our outreach program. So I'd like to thank Arts ACT for that funding, because it has actually created a very rich added dimension to our intellectual culture. I'd also like to personally thank Kathy Franzi, who has stepped in seamlessly to the role of the Art Forum coordinator and who organised Lisanne's visit here with exemplary efficiency and calm. Much more calm than I had at times during today. So thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you to what was obviously a very interested and engaged audience today. I'll ask you to join with me one last time in thanking Lisanne McGregor.